Thank you very much. I am so honored to be here. You will sometimes hear a speaker use that phrase in a way that sounds like it's a throwaway cliche, but I want you to know I feel deeply honored to be here and to be asked to give this memorial lecture, to be humbled by the opportunity to follow that film about Steve. He was always so eloquent and so powerful and so truthful in saying what we know and what we don't know, what the difference is, and what we need to do next. And I'm going to talk in what I say this evening about the subject that was of such importance to Steve Schneider. But I want to begin by honoring his memory. I first met him when he was the deputy director of a key group at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. He was passionate then, and he remained passionate always. I invited him to come and testify at one of the early hearings on global warming that I held in the Congress in the 1970s, and he was amazing. I knew right away why he had already become such a, I started to say star, but that's counter to the culture of science, but he stood out in so many ways. He was a giant of climate science, and part of what made him a giant was not only his complete command of the science, but also the passion that was so evident in his heart. He was remarkable, and of course I always felt that that passion was only appropriate when the survival of human civilization is at stake. Why not be passionate? I want to acknowledge his widow, Terry Root. We had a wonderful ceremony earlier dedicating a monument, a bench, the most beautiful one I've ever seen. I invite all of you who haven't been out to see it to go and use it and contemplate important things in that beautiful place. And I want to acknowledge Steve's brother, Peter Schneider, and his wife, Sue, and his sister, Liz Linderfeld, and Liz's husband, Mike, and their daughter, Sarah. I appreciate the student leadership responsible for this event, and I look forward to questions from Connor Doherty and Elise Timtim and Noemi Walzebuk, and thank you, Noemi, for introducing me. You mentioned that I just written a book called The Future, and I began that process by gathering a dozen of the brightest people that I could find for a scoping exercise. And I asked a question designed to elicit some emotional content, and I asked them, first off, well, how do you feel about the future? And one of them stopped me by saying, well, I feel fine. And it didn't help me that much, but it reminded me of a story that I first heard 35 or more years ago, and when I was in the House of Representatives. I was finishing a day full of town hall meetings in my congressional district, a rural farming district in Middle Tennessee, and I was driving back. Do we have a Tennessean here? Great. Some of us make it out this far west. And I was driving back to my farm in Carthage, Tennessee, and I was listening to a program on the radio called the Grand Old Opry. And most of you are too young to remember that show. It's still on. It's the longest running radio show in the world, but it's a country music show. And in those days, they had a wonderful comedian named Cousin Minnie Pearl. And she wore a straw hat with a price tag still hanging on it, and she was from the mythical community of Grinder Switch, Tennessee. Anyway, she told this story that evening. about a farmer who was involved in an accident. And he suffered harm, and he sued the other driver for damages. And in the courtroom, he was put on the witness stand by the lawyer for this other driver, and the lawyer asked the farmer, "Now, isn't it true that immediately after this accident took place, you said, 'I feel fine'?" And the farmer said, "Well, it's not that simple. You see, I was taking my cow to town in the back of my truck, and this fellow came driving across the center of the highway," and the lawyer said, "Wait a minute. I object. We're in the middle of a trial here. We don't want to hear a long, involved story. Just answer the question, yes or no. Did you or did you not say, after the accident, 'I feel fine'?" And the farmer said, "Well, I was leading up to that. You see, I was taking my cow to town in the back of my truck, and this feller came driving across the center line and ran right smack dab into my truck and knocked it over and threw me out and threw the cow out. I was on one side, the cow was on the other. The policeman came up and took one look at that cow and said, she is suffering. Pulled out his gun and shot her right between the eyes. Then he came around to my side of the truck and said, "How do you feel?" So I said, "I feel fine." And I think that is the way many people feel about the future right now. Compared to what? You got to feel fine, but many of us have the increasingly uneasy feeling that some of the challenges that we now face are in danger of spiraling out of control. I am an optimist, truly an optimist. But the beginning of optimism for me is taking a very clear view and making a very honest assessment of exactly what we face and what we need to do to safeguard the future. I'm not going to cover all the themes in the book I mentioned this evening. I'm going to concentrate on the two topics that are the subject of this evening: climate and democracy. When we attempt to shape the future, we have, broadly speaking, two powerful tools with which to shape our destiny. One is democracy, and the other is capitalism, or markets, the economy. And I spoke to a smaller group earlier today at the business school about sustainable capitalism and some of the reforms that are desperately needed to fix our market system, a system in which I deeply believe, but which is now fraught with distortions that are very much a part of the climate crisis and some of the other problems we're trying to solve. But I want to speak this evening about climate and democracy, because even when we turn to the problem of reforming markets, we have to have policy solutions that originate in our democratic discourse and our democratic process. But first of all, a word, more than a word, about the climate crisis. As the old saying goes, there's good news and bad news. You probably know a great deal about the bad news. We are putting 90 million tons of global warming pollution every single day into the atmosphere as if the atmosphere is an open sewer. We signal to large polluters and everyone else that this thin shell of atmosphere encasing our home planet, our only home, is fair game as an open sewer. Just dump whatever you want into it and don't worry about it. You know, in the late 19th century in London, there was a cholera epidemic. Cholera, which used to be one of the major causes of death around the world was not understood. And a doctor made a map locating every single case of cholera in the epidemic and then overlaid it on a map of London's sewer system. That enabled him to identify a single pump on Broad Street in downtown London as the cause of the epidemic, and not long after, Louis Pasteur identified the bacteria that was the real cause of the disease. He connected the dots, literally. And in looking at the consequences of our use of the planet's atmosphere as an open sewer, we have to connect the dots in order to understand the consequences and to absorb the powerful case for changing behavior and stopping the cause of the climate crisis. The accumulation of global warming pollution from human activities now in the planet's atmosphere traps as much extra heat every 24 hours as would be released, the scientists tell us, by 400,000 Hiroshima atomic bombs going off every day on Earth. And while the planet is very large, that's a lot of energy. And the atmosphere is a surprisingly thin shell. And that extra heat is, of course, what raises global temperatures. Has been for some time, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution particularly, but with increasing momentum and force during the last 50 years and particularly during the last 20 years. That extra heat energy is radically disrupting the hydrological cycle of our planet. We are made up of mostly water. The planet is a water planet. The cycle of water through the biosphere is essential to life. We all know these things, and we all know the hydrological cycle, when the evaporation from the oceans comes over the land and falls as precipitation and then works its way through the streams and rivers back to the sea. We are used to the contours of the same hydrological cycle that has been in place for the entire existence of urban civilization. The first cities date back only 9,000 years. After the last ice age, there was a period of transition when the new climate equilibrium was settling into place. And once it did, the first cities were founded, the agricultural revolution began, and human civilization began its upward climb to where we are today. All of human recorded history has taken place and developed within that same climate equilibrium. When it is disrupted, the consequences can be far more serious than we sometimes allow ourselves to realize. The old song, "You don't know what you've got till it's gone," applies. The disruptions of the water cycle began with the evaporation of more water vapor from the oceans, and the warmer air holds much more water vapor. Each degree Celsius increases the holding capacity by 7%. Already in just the last 30 years, the air above the oceans, the majority of our planet, of course, contains 4% more water vapor than it did only 30 years ago. Why is that significant? 4% may not sound like much. Well, when storm conditions release a downpour of either rain or snow, the precipitation that falls to the ground does not all originate in the part of the sky directly above the point of impact. These storms frequently reach out 2,000 kilometers and entrain the rivers of water vapor in the sky and pull them inland toward the place where the storm leaves the precipitation. If you have a bathtub and pull the drain, rather obviously the water going down the drain doesn't come just from the part of the tub directly above the drain. Well, there are vast basins of water vapor, and when the drain is pulled, so to speak, the amount that falls increases more than 4%. And so we get these massive storms and floods. And as the oceans warm, of course, the energy released makes the wind of the ocean-based storms much stronger. The same extra heat also pulls the moisture out of the soil and contributes to wider and deeper droughts of the kind we have been seeing in this country and around the world. The ice is melting, not only in the mountains, but now in Greenland, as Steve was telling us, and now in Antarctica. A new study at the beginning of last week confirmed that the melting rate there has accelerated beyond anything previously known. It is a large and stable amount of ice that will take a great deal of time to melt. But the North Polar ice cap will not take long at all. It's a floating ice cap. And even though that doesn't affect sea level, it does affect the atmospheric currents, the northern jet stream, the storm track. And all around the world, the timing of precipitation events has been altered so that subsistence farmers can no longer rely on the knowledge they have learned from their parents and grandparents and prior generations. The clockwork of rainy season, dry season in the tropics and subtropics is disrupted. Heat stress alone reduces crop yields. We have had 2 all-time record food price spikes within the last 5 years. One followed the worst drought and the worst fires in the 1,000 years of recorded Russian history. And 4 months later, Russia and its neighbors, Ukraine and Kazakhstan, cut off all food exports to the rest of the world. It was a food vendor in Tunisia who began the Arab Spring. Many other factors were involved, but those of us in comfortable, wealthy, developed countries sometimes overlook the fact that, unlike in our lives, poor people in less developed countries spend 50, 60% of their income on food. And when the prices go up, it's not a minor matter. The melting of the ice in the land-based regions of ice and snow is raising sea level. And the combination of sea level rise and storm surges is creating havoc in many coastal areas, particularly delta areas like those in Bangladesh. A few years ago, I came here to Stanford on the eve of the production of the movie An Inconvenient Truth. In fact, part of it was filmed on this campus. And after it was released, the single most frequent criticism from deniers and skeptics was focused on a part of that film that presented an animation of seawater coming into Manhattan Island and flooding the site of the World Trade Center Memorial. And the skeptics cried foul, ridiculous, demagogic, they said. Could never happen. It happened at the end of October last year, way ahead of schedule. It wasn't the only thing that happened in the United States last year connected to the climate crisis. we had $110 billion worth of climate-related disaster damage in the United States in 2012, which was, remember, the hottest year in recorded history for the U.S. 61% of the country was in drought. And while some try to dispute the connection to climate, it is precisely the kind of consequence that has long been predicted as a result of the drying atmospheric currents that move northward into the southwest of the United States and Mexico. And in Europe, threatened southern Europe and Turkey and the Balkans and the eastern Mediterranean with desiccation, and threaten other areas as well. In connecting the dots between these extreme weather events and the climate crisis, we find an agenda for solutions. The developing countries, which historically were more resistant to the kinds of solutions that are now necessary, are changing their tune. India has just imposed a tax on coal. China is discussing a tax on CO2 and has begun a pilot program in 2 cities and 5 provinces to implement a cap and trade system, announcing recently that within 3 years it is intended to be spread throughout the nation of China. Australia, the largest coal exporter in the world, just imposed a tax on coal and a cap and trade system. Last year was also the hottest year in Australia's history. You may have seen that the temperatures increased so much that they had to come up with a new color in the palette used to mark the temperature extremes. So the consequences, and there are many that I have not even mentioned, require us to act. Here is the good news. In 2010, for the first time in the history of the world, global investments in renewable energy exceeded global investments in fossil fuels. A lot of people are surprised by that fact. And indeed, last year and in 2011, the numbers reversed again. But renewable energy is growing far, far more rapidly than anyone predicted that it would. There is precedent for predictions on technology dispersal being wrong. And the precedents often involve widely distributed technologies. Remember mobile phones when they were first introduced? I came across a picture recently of me as a young congressman holding one of those old bricks and it looked so ridiculous. And I remembered at the time how cool I thought it looked. Well, at the time, the predictions on how quickly this new, exciting, exotic technology would spread throughout the world turned out to be not only wrong, but way wrong. Today, you can go to the poorest country in Africa and find virtually everyone using mobile phones. And indeed, in countries that do not have established telephone line terrestrial networks, you can leapfrog that technology. We know that. But my point is that solar electric production, particularly with photovoltaic cells, and electricity production with windmills is similar. Nations without an established electric grid can leapfrog the old reliance on central station fossil fuel-powered generating plants and go straight to the widely dispersed generation of electricity based on renewables. And it's happening. The investments in developing countries now exceed those in developed countries. The cost of both solar and wind is coming down far more rapidly than anyone would have predicted. The efficiency is improving more rapidly. The more solar and wind we use, the cheaper it gets. The more coal and oil we use, the more expensive it gets. So those lines have crossed, will continue to cross, and point us toward a much brighter future. But we are not making progress rapidly enough. Emissions are still increasing. Emissions of global warming pollution from developing countries now exceeds the total emissions from developed countries. Only 4 years ago, China was a smaller emitter than the U.S. This year, their emissions are 160% of those in the U.S., and 4 years from now, they will double those of the U.S. China may make a decision to move more rapidly toward renewables. I certainly hope that they do. We are seeing multiple reasons why they must. Perhaps you saw the stories this week about Chinese business people making plans to leave Beijing and Shanghai because they don't want their children to grow up with such dirty air. We have multiple reasons for making this transition as well. How many wars in oil-rich regions before we understand the extra benefits of getting off this addiction to carbon fuels? How many more Deepwater Horizon oil spills? How many more pipeline spills like the one in Arkansas just 2 weeks ago, or in Utah 2 weeks ago? How much more damage to the environment? The tar sands? Please. When I was in Alberta a few years ago, I was asked, I was intemperate in my response to the question is, should we use these tar sands? And I said, well, junkies find veins in their toes when the ones in their arms and legs give out. This actually did not endear me to the provincial government in Alberta. And they're now doing some good things there for sure. In order to move with appropriate speed, we have to use the power of democracy to change policies. We should ban use of the tar sands. We should put a tax on CO2. We should eliminate the subsidies for fossil fuels. The world is now spending $500 billion a year to encourage the destruction of the habitability of our planet. But in order to solve the climate crisis, the world needs leadership from the United States of America. And in order to get leadership from the United States of America, we have to address forthrightly the democracy crisis. Please hear me well. Our democracy has been hacked. The operating system has been taken over. It is now being made to function in ways that do not serve the interests of the majority of the American people. Since the recovery following the Great Recession, if you add up all of the additional national income in our country since 2010, 93% of it went to the wealthiest 1%. That's not an Occupy Wall Street slogan. That is a mainstream economic statistic. What other evidence is there that our democracy has been hacked? What if I told you that 90% of Americans want to see background checks so that maniacs and those who are unbalanced and unstable are not allowed to buy machine guns, or automatic weapons, and even though 90% of the people hold that position, the Senate of the United States is incapable of doing the public's will. You know that to be the case. What if I told you that after our nation was brutally and mercilessly attacked on September 11th, 2001, we sought revenge by sending hundreds of thousands of soldiers to invade and occupy a country that had absolutely nothing to do with the attack? A country which, however, just happens to have a lot of oil. I know it's more complicated, but actually it's really not. The day before the United States Senate voted to endorse the invasion of a country that hadn't attacked us, public opinion polls showed that 75% of the American people had become convinced that Saddam Hussein was responsible for flying the planes into the Twin Towers and the Pentagon and the field in Pennsylvania. That is a sad commentary about the quality of the democratic discourse. When I say our democracy has been hacked, I say it in part because I love this country so deeply. That's not a throwaway phrase. I have devoted most of my life to addressing the future of this country. I was an elected official for a long time. I've watched this process by which our democracy has become degraded get worse. And when a great nation repeatedly makes important decisions on the basis of information that is completely and totally false, no wonder we have problems. We allowed mortgages to be sold in the marketplace after they were originated from home buyers who had absolutely no way of making monthly payments. Were not required to make a down payment. Couldn't pass the most rudimentary credit check. Why? Well, there were commissions to be made. It was a good, profitable business, and the assumption was that if you take 7.5 million mortgages given to people who can't pay them back, and then lump them all together and securitize them and link them up with some phony pseudo-insurance policy and sell them into the global marketplace, the risk will magically go away. It didn't. When the assumption was challenged, it collapsed, and we had a global run on banks and the Great Recession, from which we are still attempting to achieve escape velocity. And since that time, nothing has been done to prevent a recurrence of the same thing all over again. Our democracy has been hacked. I'll give you another example. 80% of the precious supply of 80% of the antibiotics that are sold in the United States of America every year are given as a food supplement to livestock. Not to protect them against disease, but because in a little understood effect, it increases the rate of weight gain and marginally adds to the profits of the livestock producers. Now, the scientists know and have proven that germs from humans that are now resistant to antibiotics jump to these animals, and after being dosed on a regular basis with antibiotics day after day after day, of course, develop resistance to those antibiotics and then jump back to humans where they are no longer vulnerable to the healing powers of antibiotics. So, does that make sense? We could head back to a time when a cut on someone's leg could lead to their death. Antibiotic-resistant bacteria are multiplying, and we know the principal cause. So time after time, a remedy is proposed in our Congress, and it is voted down. Why? The livestock producers are paying attention. It is important to them. They are passionate. The general public barely knows that the issue is being discussed because they're not told. The same news media that force-fed information found to be utterly false about the Iraq War does not inform people about serious issues, nor do they inform people about climate. We just went through a presidential election last year, you may have noticed, in which there were more televised debates than in any election in history by far. In a year where we had $110 billion of disaster damage related to climate, Superstorm Sandy, the drought, the other things that I've mentioned. Is it just me, or do you find it odd that not a single journalist asked a single question of any of the candidates in any of the debates about climate? I find it odd. The airwaves are filled with ads for clean coal and ExxonMobil solving it, whatever it is. And yes, most of the advertising is designed to get people to buy products, but what the energy industry has been doing is different. When you see those ads for clean coal, they're not designed to make you turn to your doormate and say, hey, let's go down to the store and get us some clean coal. No. They're designed to condition political thinking. In order to solve the democracy crisis, you, all of us, have to become passionately involved in democracy. Here too, I am hopeful for a reason that requires a brief explanation. We have seen from the beginning of America until now a dramatic series of changes in the way we communicate with one another. When our country was founded, the printing press defined the information ecosystem in which representative democracy emerged. Individuals had low entry barriers to join a public conversation. Ideas that resonated with others, even if they were contributed by the humblest citizen, could find people who expressed agreement, and when a critical mass was reached, ideas could become as important as wealth and power was in the old world. In the last third of the 20th century, television surpassed newsprint, and the advantage measured in numbers of people who get information from the two media, respectively, continued to widen to the point where today 80% of the campaign money spent in both major political parties goes to purchase 30-second television ads. And they're expensive, and they get more expensive each year. Think of the difference between the print era and today. In January of 1776, an impoverished immigrant from England, then living in Philadelphia, Thomas Paine, with no money or connections or sources of social leverage, had a clear mind and a gift for written communication. And he wrote Common Sense, which became the Harry Potter of the late 18th century. And he walked out of his front door in Philadelphia and found a dozen low-cost print shops within 10 square blocks. And when he printed Common Sense, it helped to ignite the American Revolution. Now think of a modern Thomas Paine. Living in Philadelphia, he has just completed a 2-hour video called Common Sense. And he walks out his door and down to the nearest television station, and he says, "This is going to change the world. It means everything. When do I go on the air?" He doesn't go on the air. He doesn't have the many millions of dollars required to purchase access to the air, which in this day and time means access to the public's mind, to the public sphere, to the public forum. The public forum, unlike in the early days of our republic, now has gatekeepers who charge exorbitant rents. And if you don't have the money to pay the gatekeeper, you don't have access to the public mind. Well, politicians obviously have access. You see these ads at election time, lots and lots of them. Where do they get the money, I wonder? I don't wonder because I know, and you know. They get it from wealthy special interests, mostly corporate special interests, who are interested in particular legislative agendas. And they are increasingly brazen in demanding quids pro quo for the campaign contributions. It has gotten so bad that the average congressman now spends 5 hours a day on the telephone and at cocktail parties begging rich people and special interests for money. When I say our democracy has been hacked, let me boil it down to the simplest possible terms. I mentioned that I had experience in this, in the operations of our democracy as an elected official. I want to tell you that when at the age of 28 I became a congressman, before I was even sworn in, I started having open meetings, town hall meetings in every part of my district. Listening to men and women in each little community hold forth with their views on what ought to be changed, what should be done. And I was so full of energy and commitment and passion. And of course, I wanted to impress them. I wanted to be reelected. I wanted them to see me and understand that I was working for them and doing my best. But it became something more than that simple political equation. It gave me a thrill in my heart, really and truly, that lives with me now. It's almost impossible to describe in words. If I was being corny and funny, I would say I could almost hear the Battle Hymn of the Republic being hummed in the background. It was like that. It became something larger than me and the people in these courtrooms and town meetings. And if I found in Washington the following Monday that things were different from what I had told them, I would go back and explain. And I spent most all of my time thinking about what was going to be in their interests, really and truly, and doing everything I could to serve their interests. Now, I'm not saying I'm any better person than many of those who are in the same offices today. I'm saying there are good people who are now trapped in a very bad system, and here's why. Human nature being what it is, if instead of going to these town hall meetings and thinking constantly about what's in the public interest, you have to spend 5-6 hours a day begging rich people and special interests for money, the next time you vote, the next time you write a speech, are you going to start to think about the impact of your vote on the telephone calls you make tomorrow? Sure you are. And some don't, but most do. Again, it is human nature. So when I say democracy has been hacked, there's the heart of it right there. They become beholden to the sources of money that are central to the possibility of being reelected. What if they leave office? When I went to the Congress, it was rare, not unknown, but rare for a former congressman or senator to become a lobbyist. It happened. Do you know what the percentages are today? Former United States senators, what percentage of them do you think are now employed as lobbyists? 50%. U.S. House members, there are more of those. 40%. When the climate legislation was pending before the Congress 3 years ago, there were 4 anti-climate lobbyists working the halls of the Congress for every single member of the House and Senate. My favorite basketball player of all time was Michael Jordan. If he had been covered by 4 defensive players every step he took on the court, he wouldn't have scored as often. Our democracy has been hacked. Now, I've talked about the print revolution and how our democracy was born. I've talked about the age of television, which is still dominant. But Act 3 was born here in Silicon Valley, and it's the internet. And we can sometimes get carried away in our excitement about what the internet means and start to believe that it's already dominant. It's not. Look at the advertising rates. Television is still dominant by far, not even close, but times are changing. I hope that many of you will enlist in the cause of solving our democracy crisis so that we can solve the climate crisis. We need to move the institutions of our democracy onto the internet so that individuals once again have free access to the public discourse in a forum that the American people pay attention to, that affects their thinking. Already individual bloggers are having an impact on specific debates. The day is coming when the conversation about the climate crisis will change, when our democracy will begin functioning again. We already see signs. When I say the conversation will change, I want to tell you two short stories. The first was from my boyhood. I spent all of my summers in Tennessee, and I remember when the conversation about civil rights was won. One of my acquaintances made a quasi-racist comment, and another friend said, "Hey, shut up, man, we don't talk that way anymore." And in millions of conversations across the South and across America, the conversation was won, and the laws changed, and we have a long way to go, but we've made a lot of progress. I see some of it in the Oval Office right now, as a matter of fact. 2 months ago, second story, two gay men standing in a long line waiting for pizza, holding hands. A homophobe walks by them and makes a nasty comment. Literally every other person in that line turned on him and said, "Shut up, man. We don't talk like that." We're winning that conversation. And to people my age, if you had told most people my age 4 years ago, 3 years ago, 2 years ago, that gay marriage would become legal in the United States and that the discrimination against gays would change, and then in countries around the world, gay marriage would be legalized, most people would have said, "Gee, I hope so, but just don't think that it's possible to have that much change so quickly." Change often comes quickly when consciousness changes. We have to become conscious of the fact that our home is in profound danger. We've quadrupled population in 100 years, and 85% of the energy of Earth Inc. comes from fossil fuels. We are spewing all of this global warming pollution at record levels, and we are destroying the climate balance and the ecological integrity of the earth. We have to become conscious of what we're doing so that we can change it. And then in order to change it, we as Americans have to become committed to restoring the integrity of our democracy. There is no other country in the world that has the remotest possibility of providing the kind of leadership that our world needs today in the face of this grave existential crisis for global civilization. We are it. No other nation can do it. So it's up to us. And yet our democracy is in such pathetic disrepair that not a single meaningful reform that affects the interests of any powerful industry can possibly pass the Congress today. It's pathetic. Where is our pride as Americans who believe in the majesty and integrity of democracy? It is time for us to stand up and restore it. We can, but not by watching television 5 hours a night. Not by tweeting alone, but by doing the hard work of winning the conversation. I'll tell you one final story before I close. And it also goes back to my childhood. I was 13 years old in 1961 when I heard President John F. Kennedy issue his famous challenge to put a person on the moon and return him safely within 10 years. And I remember so vividly hearing adults in that day and time say, "Whew, that was a mistake. That's going to be so expensive. It's never been done before. It's very unwise. not looking forward to seeing this fall flat on its face. But 8 years and 2 months later, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin set foot on the moon. And the moment they did so, a great cheer went up in NASA's Mission Control in Houston. The systems engineers in the room that day, you know what their average age was? 26. That means when they heard that challenge, they were 18. You have a challenge. I hope that you will decide to be a part of it. I know some of you already have. We need you. Remember that when you are my age, your children will ask you one of two questions, depending on the circumstances in which they find themselves. If there are hundreds of millions of climate refugees and failures of governance and collapses of economies and stronger storms and deeper droughts and bigger floods and all the chaos that the distinguished scientific community has warned us of, every national academy in the world, they would be justified in asking you in the future, hey, what'd you do? Were you watching Dancing with the Stars? What's the deal here? But if they look around them and find a world in renewal, with tens of millions of new jobs in solar and wind and energy efficiency and sustainable agriculture and sustainable forestry and better designs for cities and transportation systems, and people with hope in their hearts and an outlook toward the future that convinces them their future is going to continually get brighter instead of spiral downward, they will ask you, how did you find the moral courage to rise up and shake off the torpor and do what was necessary to save the future? We've got everything we need with the possible exception of political will. But political will is a renewable resource. Thank you very much.